Greetings, nature nerds, and welcome back to Ask an Ecologist. My name is Suzanne Simpson, and I'm an ecologist for Bayou Land Conservancy here in Houston, Texas. And each week, you and I visit about your nature questions. Now, this is the 25th episode of Ask an Ecologist, and I never ever thought that I would be doing so many of these. But we are almost at our 6-month anniversary of working from home, and I've really enjoyed doing this. You guys have made it super fun, and I hope that you'll continue to submit questions for however long this is going to be. Let's hang out together every Thursday at 3. It's fun for me. Hope you like it too. This entire video is going to be dedicated to Gulf Coast sharks. Now, give me just a second. I want to make sure that I was actually live there. Little internet connectivity issue. So this whole video is going to be dedicated to Gulf Coast sharks. Mia Kochia sent in a question from her son, age 8, who asked to have a video made about Gulf Coast sharks. I thought that was a great idea, great suggestion. And so today is going to be dedicated to that and all the questions that I've received about the sharks that live in the Gulf of Mexico. So let's get right into it, okay? We're going to focus on 4 species of sharks that are relatively common in the Gulf of Mexico area. So we're going to talk about the great hammerhead shark, the bull shark, lemon shark, and the blacktip shark. Okay, so those are going to be our 4. Now, to answer the elephant in the room, or perhaps the great white shark in the room, do we get great white sharks in Texas, like off of our waters? So generally, the great white sharks are not going to swim that far north in the Gulf of Mexico, so where they would ever be seen by someone that's hanging out on a beach. They prefer a little bit cooler waters. But there was a great white shark earlier this year that was observed west of the Mississippi River in Louisiana, and there seemed to be other sharks that were probably around her or behind her, and they seemed to be making their way towards Texas. So it is possible, but those sharks are more than likely going to be in a far offshore area where they're not going to be seen unless you yourself are going far offshore. So that's the situation for the great white shark in the Gulf of Mexico. And as we are going to talk about a lot, these habitat preferences, these species distributions are in flux right now because of the changing conditions that we're seeing in our oceans. Let's get to the 4 main species that we're going to talk about today. Number 1, the great hammerhead shark. Even by shark standards, this is a large shark. It can get to over 15 feet long. And it has that really oddly shaped characteristic hammerhead, which is called a cephalofoil. And what that enables it to do is, because its head is longer, it's able to see and smell more surface area of the ocean, so they can keep an eye out for potential prey. The great hammerheads have probably the worst reputation of the hammerhead sharks, and that's possibly undeserved. Divers have reported that they are not interested in them, they do their own thing, and then other divers have reported that they can get a little bit territorial, sometimes they can charge a little bit. So sort of a mixed review on the behavior of great hammerhead sharks. There aren't really a ton of reported attacks, but sometimes they can get a little bit aggravated whenever humans are in their homes, and that makes sense to me. The bull shark is quite common. This is a really, really interesting shark in that it can live in both salt and fresh water. It's not a true freshwater shark, but it can live there, or it can live in water that's a little bit more brackish. In fact, there was a bull shark that once took a trip up the Mississippi River and was spotted all the way in Illinois. So this is a very adaptable shark to a lot of different conditions, and that begets why it's so common. It's very adaptable, and it's probably responsible for the majority of near-shore shark attacks, because it is, it's populous, it's a common shark, and it hangs out in areas where it can more commonly come into contact with other humans. So chances are you've heard of a bull shark. it does tend to stand its ground a bit more, and so it can have a little bit more of a human-wildlife interaction than other shark species. The lemon shark is one that you will find around docks and piers near the shore, or out on the in the ocean. You can often find it near the surface. And the lemon shark kind of flips the script of what most wildlife behavior is, and that the females are polyandrous. So the females are the sex that takes more than one mate during the breeding season. Lemon sharks are rarely dangerous to humans, so if you're able to see one, it's probably not going to come into conflict with you. And then the fourth shark is our black tip shark. These have a much more timid disposition. In fact, whenever the black tip shark is sharing water with other species of similar size, they're often outcompeted by those species because they are more low-key, a little more timid, and less likely to compete for resources and escalate those conflicts. A cool thing about black tip sharks is whenever they're going to land somewhere, like in the ocean, they will jump out of the water and spin around, and then jump back in and spin around a few times before they land, which whenever I read that, it totally reminded me of like what dogs do whenever they're about to like lay on a bed, where they have to like spin around 20 times to get it just right. So that is an interesting behavior of the black tip sharks. The spinner shark also does that. So what do these four sharks have in common? Well, one thing is that their greatest threat is humans. So our greatest threat is not sharks, but sharks' greatest threats are us. Habitat degradation, overfishing, and changing sea conditions have drastically altered the populations of these species. So a thread that I tend to weave into all of our conversations about wildlife, especially those that can come into conflict with humans, is that we are truly the greatest threat to that animal, and but we ourselves are only very rarely threatened by them. So they're worthy of our respect and our conservation. So Joyce Almaguer Reisdorf wrote in and asked, we would like to know how we expect our Gulf Coast shark populations to be affected by sea surface temperatures, sea level rise, and ocean acidification. So good question. Those are three effects of climate change, and we are going to go over all three. So we'll start with surface temperatures. So warming seas have affected where some bull sharks will have their young. So bull sharks are migratory, and scientists have observed that instead of going all the way down to Florida to have their young, that some will now stop in North Carolina because the water is now warm enough, and they'll change their breeding grounds to that area. Now, it's always a little bit unsettling whenever a species changes where it breeds, because we don't know how it'll affect that species. We also don't know how it'll affect the other sea life that's in that area. But since I'm going to say a lot of potentially unhappy things for the rest of this video, I will say that one good thing about this with bull sharks is it shows that bull sharks are willing to change their breeding grounds as conditions change, and that tends towards their adaptability. And that means that as conditions change, the bull shark in particular may be able to adapt to those conditions fairly quickly, as opposed to a species like salmon that has a really high site fidelity, or species of sea turtles where they are going to go back to that exact same location year in and year out. An animal's ability to adapt in the world that we have now can be a really important behavior for it moving forward. So other species of sharks have a really specific thermal niche, and they'll only breed whenever those conditions are just so. But those more generalist species like the bull shark are able to adapt to different places. So moving on to sea level rise. At first blush, it may sound like sea level rise could only mean good things for sharks and for other sea creatures, because more ocean means more habitat, and that's better. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. Sharks are reliant upon ecological infrastructure to raise their to be able to breed and give birth. So mangroves and reefs are both types of ecological infrastructure that they're dependent upon in order to have safe spaces for their young. And both mangroves and reefs are expected to be adversely impacted by sea level rise. Those are also huge food sources for young sharks, so their access to food might change. So it could have really important ramifications on shark species. There may be some good elements to it, but I think there are also going to be some really challenging adaptations that some species will have to make as sea level rise continues. Okay, and then lastly, ocean acidification. So until recently, maybe last 5 years or so, ocean acidification wasn't expected to specifically impact sharks. The trophic food web, yes, but sharks, it wasn't clear what those impacts would be. But recent studies have indicated that increased CO2 levels, which is what leads to ocean acidification, is reduces a shark's hunting efficiency and could limit their growth. So it in turn could limit their effectiveness as a top-down predator that's really in control of the food web. And also, acidifying oceans, studies have indicated that this may lead to corrosion and damage of a shark's skin. So this is an area that's being studied more, and we still have a lot to learn about how ocean acidification could impact sharks specifically, but it's certainly not benign. It is certainly going to impact the way that they hunt, their efficacy when they hunt, and the ultimate size that they can reach, which has important top-down effects. Now, these three factors that we've mentioned, sea temperature, surface temperatures, sea level rise, and ocean acidification, irrespective of their impact on sharks themselves, have impacts on fish. And of course, that's the primary food source of our sharks. And so it's going to have a trophic effect on the food web, regardless of how it impacts an individual shark specifically. So it's regardless of how an individual species is going to be impacted by that, we know that the food web is going to be impacted in a significant way. And we're going to see some very interesting, is a nice word, changes over the next couple of decades that will really indicate what species are able to adapt to these changes quickly over fewer generations, and what species are specialists or have a harder time adapting to the changing seas. What that means is that sharks are worthy of our respect, they're worthy of our conservation efforts, and some of these species will be solely reliant upon us to help mitigate the changes that are happening in our oceans. So sharks are going to be very dependent upon the decisions that we make in the coming years, and many of their fates will be very closely tied to those decisions. So I hope this has been a helpful video on the Gulf Coast sharks that we have. We have a lot of really interesting species in the Gulf of Mexico, and I hope you're able to get out there and see them a little bit. And be sure to keep submitting your questions each week. You can send us a Facebook message. You can leave us a comment. You can email us at info@bayouland.org. And I know some of you have submitted questions that I have not gotten to yet. I promise. I see you. I'm going to get to them. We've had a bit of a backlog and some questions that I wanted to take a deep dive on. And I will get to your questions next time or very soon. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you for hanging out with me.